Hello and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode, we're delving into the historical connection between cannabis and Native people and the current state of the cannabis economy for Native tribes across the United States. As of last year, 574 tribal governments had been recognized by the U.S. federal government, and there were more than 320 recognized American Indian reservations. But really, for more than 15,000 years, the native people of Turtle Island, as they call it, have been here, relying on kinship-based systems to form thousands of communities, all with their own laws and traditions. It wasn't until the arrival of Europeans in the mid-1500s that for many of those tribes, those traditions included using the hemp and cannabis plants for rope, fabric, medicine, and spiritual use. But starting around the mid-1800s, indigenous tribes were forcibly separated from their sacred plant by the US federal government, who would raid and burn their crops and imprison the growers. And alongside thousands of other people of color, Native people have been disproportionately incarcerated in the US ever since, simply for taking part in their history of medicine and economic trade. Around 2013, that sacred tribal relationship with cannabis took center stage. As the U.S. states of Washington and Colorado legalized medical marijuana, the discussion on tribal sovereignty as it pertains to cannabis legalization was reopened, and dozens of tribal nations started voting on their own laws to allow the resurgence of hemp and cannabis on their reservations. But it hasn't been an easy ride for the tribal cannabis economy. They still face endemic poverty issues initially caused by the brutality of colonization, which now means a lack of capital, keeping many Native people out of the potentially booming new cannabis market. Even if it's legal statewide and on the reservation, they also still face plant seizures by federal agents. And they often have to form compact agreements with state governments just to sell cannabis on their own land. Basically, Native American tribes still don't have sovereignty or a real seat at the table when it comes to legal weed. So how can Native communities deal with this complex web of tribal, state, and federal cannabis laws? Who's educating them on how to successfully and legally operate their cannabis businesses? And who's fighting to make sure that the soon-to-be nationwide cannabis industry isn't being totally colonized as well? Our first guest this episode is Mary Jane Oatman, founder of the National Indigenous Cannabis Coalition and the Tribal Hemp and Cannabis Magazine, or THC Magazine. As a leading Native American cannabis advocate, Mary Jane Oatman says it is no longer about asking permission when it comes to tribes accessing the cannabis plant. She is demanding that colonial practices stop intervening with the healing journeys of the people of this land. She wants to make sure tribal needs are being met, opportunities are being presented, and voices are being heard. So in 2019, Mary Jane launched the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition out of Idaho and started the THC Magazine so that tribal members could see success among other tribes in cannabis. She's also collaborating with other Native people to make a tribal nations dispensary and farm map so that they can highlight how many Indigenous cannabis companies there are and help people find and support them. And she's organizing an Indigenous Cannabis Conference in Cape Town, South Africa in January 2025 to make sure that more tribal cultivators and cannabis communities are at the table when their nation's policies are being made. Then we'll be talking to Native writer Santiago Rodriguez-Tarditi about his latest article in the new summer issue of Different Leaf, the magazine, which is all about the importance of Mary Jane Oatman's advocacy and education work with global tribal communities. You can get your issue now at differentleaf.com or go to the subscribe and shop tab to find your local in-person retailer. That's differentleaf.com. We'll be right back with Mary Jane Oatman.
Hi, my name is Mary Jane Oatman. I'm a member of the Nez Perce tribe, and I serve as the executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, which is a 501c6 trade organization serving tribes and tribal entrepreneurs. And I'm also the founder of the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, which publishes Tribal Hemp and Cannabis Magazine. It's a educational nonprofit to help end the negative stigma of this wonderful plant medicine in tribal communities.
Awesome. It's such a pleasure to meet you, Mary Jane. Thank you so much for being with us today. But let's talk a little bit first about you and your connection to the cannabis plant. So you got involved in the advocacy in the industry back in 2019, but I assume you have a much longer connection with cannabis. What's your background with the plant?
Oh, goodness. I definitely have in the industry what's known as the legacy roots. My grandmother went to federal prison for growing cannabis on the Nez Perce Indian Reservation in Idaho when I was a little girl. So I endured the whole DARE era of elementary school with that stigma, but always just such a strong connection and recognition that it was plant medicine. We just had to go a little bit more underground and just be a lot more careful to protect the family itself. But I guess that's the start of it.
Wow, your grandparents were growing it and went to jail for it. I bet there were some pretty long-term implications that came from their arrests.
It was really political, in the early 80s in Idaho. There was still a lot of jurisdictional issues. If that same scenario happened now, it would be a complete different story. My grandfather, who was non-native, actually went to state prison for cannabis that was grown on tribal reservation, which again, because of just jurisdictional issues, would not happen to this day. So it was just kind of like they fast-tracked their trial. Their sentences my grandpa's was longer than my grandmother's. So he went away for just a little over a year and my grandmother a year. And it was a difficult time. Going to visit your grandma in federal as a little kid was a whole other childhood experience for sure.
Yeah, I bet it was.
We are one of the treaty tribes in the Pacific Northwest. And, ironically for our community is that the hemp rope and hemp fiber was a big part of our culture and our economy prior to colonial settlement here in our homelands. It's a part of our creation story as well for the Nez Perce people. And our footprint on this landscape has been here, archaeologically speaking, for about 16,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's the oldest dated archaeological site here in reservation communities across the country or just, across Turtle Island. And it's, that connection to our strong oral traditions, as well as a connection with this textile as a women's economy, because it was our women that were the hemp rope makers and would send our men out for trade. It's been empowering for a lot of families in our community to think about cultivating hemp and reclaiming some of those cultural traditional connections.
Yeah, it was really ingrained in society, obviously, and I guess the tribal economy before Prohibition. But then I know that you'd also discussed in the article in Different Leaf that there was also a medical aspect to the use of cannabis and sort of a spiritual use of it as well. So there's so many ways that it's integrated into your lives. And you've got these deep roots in this tribal history with cannabis. It was sacred. How did Prohibition change all of that for you?
What happened with tribal communities happened far before Prohibition. In the late 1800s, they started to criminalize gatherings of Indigenous communities. They outlawed our spiritual ways. They put on full-out campaigns of indoctrinating our society and communities with Christianity. And that has been our experience and a part of the reason why there has been a deep fracture in the sacrament as well as the plant as a medicine and plant as an economy has happened so drastically is through that forced assimilation, boarding schools taking young Native children away, stripping us from our language, our landscape, and our familial ties and our strong kinship systems, because that's what most of our tribal communities were deeply rooted in, was kinship systems. And that's what ruled governance for our communities. And it's the reclamation of so much of that is happening now because tribes are saying this is no longer about permission. We've seen what this federal government experiment has done to us, and we know what we still have intact to rebuild and repair. And that's what this medicine does for so many communities. It's put us in repair mode for those that have been more accepting. But when our tribal lands are federal enclaves and we are still wards of the federal government by way of Supreme Court decisions, it's hard. I mean, it's attrition over so many centuries of our truest form of sovereignty. But what's wonderful is tribes, as far as the 574 federally recognized governments, they're made up of community members, they're made up of individuals, and many of us individuals have always kept that strong. And it's different for each community. And I can't ever be so bold as to speak on behalf of all of us because we have such unique histories and distinct cultures and traditions. There are still a lot of communities that are very, very opposed to this and not accepting. And I would understand that in these border communities down there in, California and New Mexico and Arizona, where incarceration rates of federal men and women in federal prisons is drastically disproportionate for cannabis trade, transportation. And those are now families that are still in prison. Same thing in New York. Families where they have 2, 3 members of one family, sisters and brothers, incarcerated in federal prison for transportation of cannabis.
Wow.
So the pardons that were supposed to happen, it's kind of ironic, that under the Biden administration, the pardon announcement is that there's not a lot of our tribal members that are incarcerated in federal prison over just the simple possession. They're adding on the transport. There's other charges, conspiracy, they stack it so much to where they're not in that bubble of you get out of prison and eventually you're going to be a part of these legacy and justice, funded projects that can help you find a legitimate pathway in these careers. Indian country is way far behind in that.
Wow. So there's so much to catch up on. Now, I obviously not American, so I have learned later in life about the American history with Native American tribes and how the laws now differ in tribal lands versus state laws and versus federal laws. So I'm a little bit foggy on this. And for any of our listeners that also don't quite understand this, when something like cannabis is, like, say, recreationally legalized at the state level, is that the same for the tribal land that is in that state, or is it separate laws that are passed for tribal land and cultivation and processing in tribal regions?
So what has been really unique to see is that it has primarily been when a state moves forward in some form or fashion, medical in the earlier days when states were opening up, that was kind of the tribes in, like, specifically in Washington state, starting to see, okay, if this is happening here, we need to participate in this economy or regulate our homelands, against things that we don't want coming into our community. So that was really, where we saw in the states that legalized cannabis in some fashion or form early on was that's when states or tribes started to move. There's always been a market or a trade with this cannabis as a commodity in some sort of trade network across the nation. But when it came to the legalized, like regulated, licensed, permitted, we really saw that start to creep up primarily in Washington state because they have very unique government to government relationships. And the governor of Washington recognizes in contacting with the state of Washington, it strengthens the state sovereignty as well as the tribes. It protects public health and safety at a greater rate. There's just more reciprocity between the markets. But at the same time, these contacts, they're not ceding taxes to the state. Those are staying in the community. The parameters within the agreements are very beneficial to those tribes. Other states are not as good with their tribal state government relations to where it's adversarial. New York is a good example of that. There are no tribes compacted to do cannabis in New York. They're operating on a more sovereign market where the tribes are figuring it out on their own. But that's what we're up against is there's 574 federally recognized tribes, which means the potential for each one of those tribal communities to have their own regulatory infrastructure, their own processes. What would that look like for all of them to start working together in some fashion, in a nation to nation trade model? We do know what that looks like for tribes in certain states like Nevada, where we have the Intertribal Cannabis Commission tribes working in a trade network with each other, shared regulatory compliance, a system that is all about public health and safety, transparency and accountability in this high cash volume industry, protections, mechanisms against corruption and fraud types of things, and protecting the other folks that are in the part of the network that are like transporters that are out on the road with, large quantities of cannabis that are trying to figure out how they do it in a regulated space where they have official permits authorized from one tribe to another to be able to move in between these sovereign homelands. So tribes are figuring it out, as we would assume that they would. We figured out this gaming industry and have, mastered something like that, where that's aspects of gaming have always been a part of tribal cultures and traditions, but not this, the video lottery terminal high tech, with all of the regulations. And we figured it out. So there's absolutely no reason why we cannot with cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like as soon as legalization starts to happen, tribes are like, okay, now how can we make this work for us? Because obviously they're being left out of a lot of the laws and policies at the state level. And what we're seeing is essentially colonization of the marketplace now, because it is more than 90% owned by white men, and a lot of ethnic minorities are being completely left out of the economy as it starts to grow.
Yes.
So let's talk about your efforts to change that, to get some rights for your people, to spread education, fundraising, and work towards that sovereignty. What are you doing with the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, and what's the fight about right now?
The Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, which was started from Idaho in 2019, was very intentional to start in a state that was, I knew, going to be potentially one of the last to markets, and potentially never to market. We would have to be awaiting any form of federal legalization to occur. And so I just realized that sharing my own family's story to help end negative stigma in my own community was a first start. I don't need to necessarily do it in some big flashy way, but the nonprofit organization created an opportunity to create that coalition, to get other tribal communities' stories told, and to network them to be an advocate amongst each other and then externally. So THC Magazine is what we started with. Tribal Hemp and Cannabis Magazine is that beacon for tribes to be able to see success amongst other tribes in cannabis. The second issue, I decided to partner with an education curriculum provider across Indian country, a young man by the name of Aaron Carpella, who does Tribal Nations Map series. And he does it in the educational space, and collaborated with him to provide that same map, but change it into a Tribal Nations dispensary and farm map for Indian country. And he was super down for it. Super down. He was like, oh, cool. Yeah. So from there, we set out to utilize an education, entertainment type of a venue, a THC Magazine, to start collecting data, because that's really what was missing in Indian country, was the who is doing what, where they're doing it, how are they doing it. Yeah, we definitely already knew the why, but let's dig into the deeper of the why, as far as, the health and economic benefits, and everything else that comes with that.
So it sounds like there is a lot of work still to do, but obviously folks at the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition and THC Magazine are working on it. Let's talk about the future of what you're doing. You guys are going international. What's going on in Cape Town in 2025?
2025, we are working on part of the planning committee. So it's not something that we're doing specifically, as the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, but in partnership with global planners for a committee on diversity, where we are planning an Indigenous Cannabis Conference to be held in Cape Town.
Cool.
In 2025, in January. And it's been really exciting to be able to connect, even from our own Indigenous perspective in the communities that we work with, to make sure that more people are at the table, including South Africa. We need more of that community at the table. And even through our ICIA networks, have been able to create those inroads to Indigenous cultivators in South Africa that have really been left out of the conversation there, because as you had mentioned earlier with the colonial cannabis emergence here, that has very, very much been the case in South Africa, where I don't think none of their top producers are Indigenous. So the Sangomas, that is the word for the Indigenous producers in South Africa. We want to make sure that the Sangomas are represented as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like if you don't really band together and sort of demand your rights in this field, you will be left out of it. So I wish you and your colleagues the best of luck. You can read more about Mary Jane Oatman in the summer issue of Different Leaf, the magazine. Mary Jane, thank you so much for chatting to us, and hopefully we can catch up again in the future and see what's changed for you and your people.
I appreciate it. There's definitely be a lot on the horizon, and we just look forward and are highly honored to be able to do the work.
Thank you so much.
Next, we'll be checking in with Different Leaf writer Santiago Rodriguez-Tarditi about his article in the new summer issue of Different Leaf the magazine about the importance of Mary Jane Oatman's advocacy work and the larger context around her work within global tribal communities. Santiago, tell us a little bit about why this article with Mary Jane was interesting to you.
Of course, thank you for having me here. So for the past few years, I would say 5 or 6 years, matter of social justice has become a relevant topic in my research and my work. And I managed to connect it with another one of my passions, which is cannabis. And in that connection, I began to discover a series of overlaps where oppression or disparity or injustice was present both in minorities and the plant, the environment, and cannabis, and several other ways that I like to discuss in my work.
So for the article for Different Leaf, you've written about Mary Jane Oatman, who is a really prominent character in the Indigenous cannabis space. Let's talk about the broader context of cannabis in tribal Native American society that Mary Jane's work is going on in. How did cannabis come to be a part of Native American life?
Well, cannabis is endemic to Central or Southeast Asia. There's still a lot of debate and research ongoing to determine where exactly the first cannabis plant was born. But it migrated across the world throughout the centuries. It arrived in the Americas with the first conquistadors, with the first settlers, who used cannabis to create the canvas that would fabricate the sails that they would use on their ships to cross the Atlantic. They would also use it in the ropes. Back then, it was used for many different reasons, and it was a staple in most of the European economies. It was used for many different purposes. So it was obvious that these new settlers would bring some seeds and some plants with them on board their ships. Slowly, it started to make its way across the Caribbean and the Americas. And from there, the different uses that several communities gave to the plant included ceremonial or sacred aspect, but it was also used to create textiles and fabrics. Some people even ate the seeds or used the plant to feed themselves. Of course, there were many medicine people, both men and women, who utilized the plant to heal. I guess that's, if you look at the article, that's where I make a connection with Mary Jane's grandmother, who is part of the Nez Perce reservation. And she, for many years, distributed the plant in many different ways to support the healing of the local community. That is, of course, until the feds busted her and put her in jail for several years.
Yeah, so really the war on drugs drastically changed everybody's relationship with cannabis. But for Native American tribes, there's another layer to it because the injustice happens on the federal American government level, and then there's also courts at the tribal level. So let's talk about what that looks like now. And for people like Mary Jane's grandmother who were illegally raided by the feds on native land, and they were growing it as had been part of their culture for hundreds of years. What is the long-term impact for Native people who have been incarcerated?
This is another means towards oppressing minorities, particularly in the United States. The indigenous communities have suffered the war on drugs just as the Hispanics, the Latinos, and the Black population, a complete disparity where the laws don't seem to apply equally to everyone. And white Americans and white people have certain privileges that other communities don't. It's a very complex situation. I'm still trying to grasp my head around it because, as you mentioned, it has several different layers. The federal level, who can basically barge into these reservations at any point in search of whatever they deem is illegal. And at the same time, there are local or native systems that determine what can be used and what cannot. If you look at it historically, this is just one of many tools to repress the population, to control it, and to limit their access to personal development, to recreation, to health, and trying to keep these communities under control with very strict and very severe laws. Mary Jane has dedicated the last few years of her life to reclaiming the power of her community and the relationship they have with several plants, not just cannabis, but cannabis, of course, is her main point of discussion. But it's an ongoing and very complex situation because nobody except the community and the natives who have to live there and engage on a day-to-day with these oppressions and limitations are actually doing something about it. So Mary Jane has developed a global network of other communities who have also felt this limitation from the governments and are uniting in order to claim their rights towards themselves and their relationship with nature.
Where are there other Indigenous communities that are looking to take back their rights when it comes to cannabis?
She also mentioned a group in New Zealand. I believe she's working towards a global event next year that will unite many different communities that will ask for a revision of the laws and will raise their voices for their rights to be respected.
That's amazing work she's doing. You know, when it comes to minority and oppression from cannabis laws, we also discussed the fact that if you don't push back, you will be colonized. Like the cannabis industry itself is 90-something% run by rich white men. And if they don't pull up a chair to the table, they really won't be offered a seat at it. So it's incredibly important work that she's doing. We mentioned a little bit about the prison population that would benefit from her local work, trying to work on expungements and getting people out of prison. But there's also this piece that is going to be bolstering tribal cannabis economy. Of all the different organizations that she's working with at the moment, keeping that sovereignty for Indian country really seems to be top of her list to allow her people to reconnect with this very important plant and sort of returning to that cultural vision of cannabis as it's interconnected. What would you say for you is the most important part of Mary Jane's work? What resonated the most with you when you were reporting with her?
I think the word you just mentioned, sovereignty, is very important because what's at risk here is more than just the legalization of a plant. It's the erasure of traditions, of history, of a whole community that has a unique knowledge from thousands of years of studying plants and nature. So this isn't just about a right to consume cannabis like the main conversation in the industry might be, but it's more of a matter of representation of their folk medicine, their traditions, their ancestry. And it's very important that we do not let the indigenous knowledge go to waste. The world currently has something like 6% of indigenous population worldwide, and they are responsible for 80% of what's left of nature. They are the stewards of nature. They are in charge of the reservations. They're in charge of protecting the rivers, the mountains, the trees. So it's very important that instead of hiding their knowledge, we should put it at the forefront. We should highlight it and we should give them a big space. So what Mary Jane is doing is the result of many, many years and many, many generations that have been pushed down by the white man, by the government, by the market, and is making sure that her voice and the voice of her people is being heard.
I love that. And we really appreciate your writing for Different Leaf about it. Listeners, if you haven't yet got your summer issue of Different Leaf, the magazine, check it out. It is just a thrilling, gorgeous article that you've written about Mary Jane and her work. Santiago, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Brit.
A huge thanks to both Mary Jane and Santiago for being on the show this week. Make sure you've got your summer issue of Different Leaf the magazine from differentleaf.com so you don't miss Santiago's moving article about the importance of Mary Jane's advocacy work. You can get an issue mailed to you from differentleaf.com, or you can go to differentleaf.com and find the subscribe and shop tab to locate your nearest in-person retailer. That's differentleaf.com. Next week, we'll be talking to former drug kingpin Cos Marte, now the CEO of Conbud, the New York dispensary run and staffed by formerly incarcerated people.
I was sentenced to 7 years. I started a whole delivery service from a beeper to StarTech and Nokia cell phones back then, late 90s and early 2000s, to getting people to, do deliveries with me on bicycles. From bicycles, I had a whole fleet of cars. And at one point we had about 20 something drivers, 2 different shifts. We were generating about $5 million in revenue a year. It was a crazy system. It didn't stop there. As soon as I got locked up, I started sneaking in weed in there, and you put it in your prison pocket.
Make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening right now so you don't miss that episode. And be a love and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now if you want some extra good karma. Follow us on social media at Different Leaf, and I'm on social media at Brit the British. And make sure to check out our dope new merchandise line at xdifferentleaf.com.